大家好，
大家好，
又到我哋讀你聽嘅時候。
小
今次我哋係讀到第26節啦。
係
我哋讀緊乜嘢啊？
Charles Dickens 嘅 Great Expectations
係啦，中文係咩？
遠大前程啊！
係啦，狄更斯嘅遠大前程。咁你上回講到邊啊？
講到阿 Pip 就去咗 Mr. Wemmick 嗰個屋企，
Wemmick 係邊個啊？
嗰個算係家電咁噶，係咪啊？即係
唔
Mr.
係
Pocket 嗰個員工啊？
唔係
邊個？
，Pocket 係 Herbert 個老豆，唔關事嘅。OK，
邊個
Jagger 先係監護人啊，大佬，搞撈亂晒，
係喎，
黐線。Wemmick 係
好相似啊！你
完全唔相似。Wemmick 係 Jagger 嘅員工，佢嘅首席秘書啦，首席嘅 clerk 啦，喺佢律師行度做啦，係咪啊？咁 Wemmick 亦都講得好清楚啦，公私分明啦，係咪啊？作為一個人，即係我信得過佢都覺得阿 Pip 個人冇乜點，咁咪都唔會邀請佢去佢屋企。但係在公咧，佢都係希望阿 Pip 好嘅，即係佢在公都係希望阿 Pip 快啲同 Mr. Jaggers 做咩啊？
食飯
係啦，食飯只不過係一種象徵，即係實際上就係你食飯嗰陣時做啲咩啊嘛，唔係真係坐低就咁食就算噶嘛。其實係要討論阿 Pip 點啊，而家嚟咗 London 咯，要做啲咩啊？係咪啊？又或者阿 Pip 自己要諗，其實佢要諗清楚我要做啲乜，要攞幾多錢，係咪啊？因為佢要同Jagger 問佢攞錢噶嘛，其實佢要做任何嘢都好，讀書又好，做生意又好，係咪啊？咁就係要同 Jagger 攞錢做咯。如果唔係你有咩可以搞啫？係咪？好啦，而家 Chapter 26啦，睇下阿 Pip 幾時下定決心揾阿 Jagger 啦，又或者係 Jagger 揾佢啦嚇。It fell out as Wemmick has told me it would that I had an early opportunity of comparing my guardian's establishment with that of his cashier and clerk. My guardian was in his room, washing his hands with his scented soap, when I went into the office from Walworth, and he called me to him, and gave me the invitation for myself and friends, which Wemmick had prepared me to receive. No ceremony, he stipulated, and no dinner dress, and say tomorrow. I asked him where we should come to, and I believe it was in his general objection to make anything like an admission, that he replied, "Come here, and I'll take you home with me." I embraced his opportunity of remarking that he washed his clients off, as if he were a surgeon or a dentist. He had a closet in his room, fitted up for the purpose, which smelled of the scented soap like a perfumer's shop. It had an unusually large jack towel on a roller inside the door, and he would wash his hands and wipe them and dry them all over his towel whenever he came in from a police court or dismissed a client from his room. When I and my friends repaired to him at 6 o'clock next day, he seemed to have been engaged on a case of a darker complexion than usual, for we found him with his head butted into this closet, not only washing his hands, but laving his face and gargling his throat. And even when he had done all that, and had gone all round the jack towel, he took out his penknife and scraped the case out of his nails before he put his coat on. 其實講咁大堆嘢，即係講阿 Jagger 都好注重清潔啦。但係重點係咩？重點係 Jagger 真係邀請咗佢喎。Jagger 邀請咗佢咯喎，係咪啊？咁啊安排啲細節，咁就去嘅咯喎。咁即係話呢一個章節其實就係講佢哋食飯嘅對話。
好快。
阿 Pip 嘅將來，阿 Pip 嘅將來將會被勾畫出嚟啦。There were some people slinking about as usual when we passed out into the street, who were evidently anxious to speak with him, but there was something so conclusive in the halo of scented soap which encircled his presence that they gave it up for that day. As we walked along westward, he was recognized ever and again by some face in the crowded streets, and whenever that happened, he talked louder to me. But he never otherwise recognized anybody or took notice that anybody recognized him. He conducted us to Gerald Street, Soho, to a house on the south side of that street, rather a stately house of its kind, but dolefully in want of painting and with dirty windows. He took out his key and opened the door, and we all went into a stone hall, bare, gloomy, and little used. So up a dark brown staircase into a series of 3 dark brown rooms on the first floor. There were carved garlands on the panelled walls, and as he stood among them giving us welcome, I know what kind of loops I thought they looked like. Dinner was laid in the best of these rooms. The second was his dressing room, the third his bedroom. He told us that he held the whole house, but rarely used more of it than we saw. The table was comfortably laid, no silver in the surface, of course, and at the side of his chair was a capacious dumb waiter with a variety of bottles and decanters on it, and 4 dishes of fruit for dessert. I noticed throughout that he kept everything under his own hand and distributed everything himself. There was a bookcase in the room. I saw from the backs of the books that they were about evidence, criminal law, criminal biology, trials, acts of parliament, and such things. The furniture was all very solid and good, like his watch chain. It had an official look, however, and there was nothing merely ornamental to be seen. In a corner was a little table of papers with a shaded lamp, so that he seemed to bring the office home with him in that respect too, and to weed it out of an evening and fall to work. As he had scarcely seen my 3 companions until now, for he and I had walked together, he stood on a hearth rug after ringing the bell and took a searching look at them. To my surprise, he seemed at once to be principally, if not solely, interested in Drummle. "Pip," said he, putting his large hand on my shoulder and moving me to the window. "I don't know one from the other. Who's the spider?" "The spider?" said I. "The blotchy, sprawly, sulky fellow." "Oh, that's Bentley Drummle," I replied. "The one with the delicate face is Stuttle." 呢兩個都係佢啲 friend 嚟嘅。"Not making the least account of the one with the delicate face," he returned. "Bentley Drummle is his name, is it? I like the look of that fellow." He immediately began to talk to Drummle, not at all deterred by his replying in his heavy, reticent way, but apparently led on by it to screw discourse out of him. I was looking at the two, when there came between me and them the housekeeper with the first dish on the table. She was a woman of about 40, I suppose, but I may have thought her younger than she was. Rather tall, of a lithe, nimble figure, extremely pale, with large faded eyes and a quantity of streaming hair. I cannot say whether any diseased affection of the heart caused her lips to be parted as if she were panting, and her face to fear a curious expression of suddenness and flutter. But I know that I had been to see Macbeth at the theatre a night or 2 before, and that her face looked to me as if it were all disturbed by fiery air, like the faces I had seen rise out of the witch's cauldron. 即係講到佢好似巫婆咁，個面色差到咁啊。She set the dish on, touched my guardian quietly on the arm with a finger to notify that dinner was ready, and vanished. We took our seats at the round table, and my guardian kept Drummle on one side of him, while Startup sat on the other. It was a noble dish of fish that the housekeeper had put on table, and we had a joint of equally choice mutton afterwards, and then an equally choice bird. Sauces, wines, all the accessories we wanted, and all of the best, were given out by our host from his dumb waiter. And when they had made the circuit of the table, he always put them back again. Similarly, he dealt us clean plates and knives and forks for each course, and dropped those just disused into 2 baskets on the ground by his chair. No other attendant than the housekeeper appeared. She sat on every dish, and I always saw in her face a face rising out of the cauldron. Years afterwards, I made a dreadful likeness of that woman, by causing a face that had no other natural resemblance to it than it derived from flowing hair to pass behind a bowl of flaming spirits in the dark room. Induced to take particular notice of the housekeeper, both by her own striking appearance and by Wemmick's preparation, I observed that whenever she was in the room, she kept her eyes attentively on my guardian, and that she would remove her hands from any dish she put before him, hesitatingly, as if she dreaded his calling her back, and wanted him to speak when she was nigh, if he had anything to say. I fancied that I could detect in his manner a consciousness of this, and a purpose of always holding her in suspense. Dinner went off gaily, and although my guardian seemed to follow rather than originate subjects, I knew that he wrenched the weakest part of our dispositions out of us. For myself, I found that I was expressing my tendency to lavish expenditure and to patronize Herbert and to boast of my great prospects before I quite knew that I had opened my lips. It was so with all of us, but with no one more than Drummle, the development of whose inclination to gird in a grudging and suspicious way at the rest was screwed out of him before the fish was taken off. It was not then, but when we had got to the cheese, that our conversation turned upon our rowing feats, and that Drummle was rallied for coming up behind of a night in that slow, amphibious way of his. Drummle upon this informed our host that he much preferred our room to our company, and that as to skill he was more than our master, and that as to strength he could scatter us like chaff. By some invisible agency, my guardian wound him up to a pitch little short of ferocity about this trifle, and he fell to barring and spanning his arm to show how muscular he was, and we all fell to barring and spanning our arms in a ridiculous manner. Now the housekeeper was at that time clearing the table, my guardian taking no heed of her, but with the side of his face turned from her, was leaning back in his chair, biting the side of his forefinger and showing an interest in Drummle that to me was quite inexplicable. Suddenly he clapped his large hand on the housekeeper's like a trap as she stretched it across the table. So suddenly and smartly did he do this that we all stopped in our foolish contention. "If you talk of strength," said Mr. Jaggers, "I'll show you a wrist. Molly, let them see your wrist." Her entrapped hand was on the table, but she had already put her other hand behind her waist. "Master," she said in a low voice, with her eyes attentively and entreatingly fixed upon him. "Don't." "I'll show you your wrist," repeated Mr. Jaggers, with an immovable determination to show it. "Molly, let them see your wrist." "Master," she again murmured. "Please." "Molly," said Mr. Jaggers, not looking at her, but obstinately looking at the opposite side of the room. "Let them see both your wrists. Show them. Come." He took his hand from hers and turned that wrist up on the table. She brought her other hand from behind her and held the two out side by side. The last wrist was much disfigured, deeply scarred and scarred across and across. When she held her hands out, she took her eyes from Mr. Jaggers and turned them watchfully on every one of the rest of us in succession. "There's power here," said Mr. Jaggers, coolly tracing out the sinews with his forefinger. "Very few men have the power of wrist that this woman has. It's remarkable that mere force of grip there is in these hands. I have had occasion to notice many hands, but I never saw stronger in that respect, man's or woman's, than these." While he said those words in a leisurely, critical style, she continued to look at every one of us in regular succession as we sat. The moment he ceased, she looked at him again. "That will do, Molly," said Mr. Jaggers, giving her a slight nod. "You have been admired, and can go." She withdrew her hands and went out of the room, and Mr. Jaggers, putting the decanters on from his dumbwaiter, filled his glass and passed round the wine. "At 9:30, gentlemen," said he, "we must break up. Pray make the best use of your time. I am glad to see you all. Mr. Drummle, I drink to you." If his object in singling out Drummle were to bring him out still more, it perfectly succeeded. In a sulky triumph, Drummle showed his morose depreciation of the rest of us in a more and more offensive degree, until he became downright intolerable. Through all his stages, Mr. Jaggers followed him with the same strange interest. He actually seemed to serve as a cess to Mr. Jaggers' wine. In our boyish want of discretion, I dare say we took too much to drink, and I know we talked too much. We became particularly hot upon some boorish sneer of Drummel's, to the effect that we were too free with our money. It led to my remarking, with more zeal than discretion, that it came with a bad grace from him, to whom Startup had lent money in my presence but a week or so before. Well, retorted Drummel, he'll be paid. I don't mean to imply that he won't, said I, but it might make you hold your tongue about us and our money, I should think. You should think, retorted Drummel. Oh, Lord. I dare say, I went on, meaning to be very severe, that you wouldn't lend money to any of us if we wanted. You are right, said Drummel. I wouldn't lend one of you a sixpence. I won't lend anybody a sixpence. Rather mean to borrow under those circumstances, I should say. You should say, repeated Drummel. Oh, Lord. This was so very aggravating. The more especially as I found myself making no way against his surely obtuseness, that I said, disregarding Herbert's efforts to check me, Come, Mr. Drummel, since we are on the subject, I'll tell you what passed between Herbert here and me when you borrowed that money. I don't want to know what passed between Herbert there and you, growled Drummel. And I think, he added in a lower growl, that we might both go to the devil and shake ourselves. I'll tell you, however, said I, whether you want to know or not. We said that, as you put it in your pocket, very glad to get it. You seem to be immensely amused at his being so weak as to lend it. Drummel laughed outright and sat laughing to our faces, with his hands in his pockets and his round shoulders raised, plainly signifying that it was quite true, and that he despised us as asses all. My friend, I'm sorry. Hereupon Startup took him in hand, though with a much better grace than I had shown, and exhorted him to be a little more agreeable. Startup being a lively, bright young fellow, and Drummel being the exact opposite, the latter was always disposed to resent him as a direct personal affront. He now retorted in a coarse, lumpish way, and Startup tried to turn the discussion aside with some small pleasantry that made us all laugh. Resenting this little success more than anything, Drummel, without any threat or warning, pulled his hands out of his pockets, dropped his round shoulders, swore, took up a large glass, and would have flung it at his adversary's head, but for our entertainers dexterously seizing it at the instant when it was raised for that purpose. Gentlemen, said Mr. Jaggers, deliberately putting down the glass and holding out his gold repeated by its massive chain, I am exceedingly sorry to announce that it's 9:30. On this hint, we all rose to depart. Before we got to the street floor, Startup was cheerily calling Drummel old boy, as if nothing had happened. But the old boy was so far from responding that he would not even walk to Hammersmith on the same side of the way. So Herbert and I, who remained in town, saw them going down the street on opposite sides, Startup leading, and Drummel lagging behind the shadow of the houses, much as he was wont to follow in his boat. As the door was not yet shut, I thought I would leave Herbert there for a moment and run upstairs again to say a word to my guardian. I found him in his dressing room, surrounded by stocks of boots, already hard at it, washing his hands of us. I told him I had come up again to say how sorry I was that anything disagreeable should have occurred, and that I hoped he would not blame me much. Ugh, said he, slicing his face and speaking through the water drops. It's nothing, Pip. I like that spider, though. He had turned towards me now and was shaking his head and blowing and towering himself. I'm glad you like him, sir, said I, but I don't. No, Mr. Guardian assented. Don't have too much to do with him. Keep as clear of him as you can. But I like the fellow, Pip. He is one of the true sort. Why, if I was a fortune-teller, looking out of the tower, he caught my eye. But I am not a fortune-teller, he said, letting his head drop into a festoon of towel and towering away at his 2 ears. You know what I am, don't you? Good night, Pip. Good night, sir. In about a month after that, the spider's time with Mr. Pocket was up for good, and, to the great relief of all the house but Mrs. Pocket, he went home to the family home. 即係呢度講 成餐飯嘅過程啦。但係似乎就令我好失望，就係佢係冇講到阿 Pip 嘅將來咯。亦都即係反而喺度講呢個 Drummond 同佢哋之間嗰啲錢銀嘅糾葛啊，啲無謂嘢啊咁而呢啲嘢亦都係阿 jaggers 挑起嘅，因為 jaggers 就係唔知點解就對呢個 Drummond 比較有感興趣，就係咁同佢傾偈。咁 jaggers 咁做，究竟係真係對呢個人有感興趣啊？即係佢有承認嘅，定係佢只不過係唔想講阿 Pip 咧，同阿 Pip 有太多交談咧？因為成個章節阿 Pip 就完全係一個 sidecast，完全同佢冇關嘅。即係我諗住佢點都會講一講，起碼都要問一句：喂，你陣間上嚟我房同你傾一傾嘢，跟住問佢你係咪要等錢使啊？即係呢啲嘢都冇。即係我諗住佢可能你有啲 friend 喺度，咁我唔好意思講你啲太 personal 嘅嘢。但係佢冇咁做喎。其實佢食完飯，佢但係可以叫阿 Pip 上去房同佢傾，單獨再 short conversation， 即係講下錢啊，講下喂，咁你而家諗住點啊？我見到你啲 friend 啊，咁你咪諗住同啲 friend 做生意啊，定係點啊？完全冇。反而係阿 Drummond 咁樣飲大兩杯咁，跟住就同佢哋喺度翻舊帳咁。exactly 嗰個發生咩我唔知啦，即係咁跟住又講下佢管家咁，即係有啲不着邊際咯。即係究竟係發生咩事咧？因為如果你呢一章節又唔推進阿 Pip 嘅話咧，咁阿 Pip 就繼續無所事事嘅。咁佢又繼續同阿 Herbert 喺度一日到黑啊，識下 friend 啊，周圍玩啊咁嘅喎。咁啊有啲浪費有啲時間咯。而佢身邊嘅人亦都介紹晒啦，係咪先？佢連 Wemmick 屋企都去埋啦，Jaggers 屋企都去咗啦 ，Pocket 屋企又去咗啦，係咪？去晒㗎咯喎，咁你仲有啲咩可以做啊？你又唔識女仔，你要識女仔，你咪又係去嗰啲 public house gentleman club， 你咪又係同 Herbert 去玩。咁但係呢個咁樣唔成故事㗎嘛。你即係嗰個推動力喺呢一刻咧，我就覺得好弱啦。係。咁我諗住阿 Pip 會調翻轉頭再揾阿 Jaggers， 我以為佢就係諗住，其實我有啲嘢想同你講，但係都冇。佢想翻同咩 Jaggers 講，唔好意思啊，今晚咁 unpleasant， 道歉就算咯喎。好似 Jaggers，冇嘢，我冇擺心啊，得啦走。咁走咗。咁咪冇推進。咁阿 Pip 你都要大個仔㗎嘛，開始。咁你究竟係點啊？你係要讀書啊，定係去做律師啊，做 clerk 啊，定係做警察啊，定係做乜嘢啊？係咪都唔知啊？定係佢同阿 Herbert 去傾下偈先啦，傾下大家有咩做先咧？咁呢一刻就冇推動力嘅。咁我期待就係。咁下一節可能有啲突發事件啦，定係有啲咩事啦？即係我又唔覺得要有第二個 Estella 去激發阿 Pip 咯，我又覺得唔係咁樣咯，因為已經第一個 Estella 激發到阿 Pip 有今時今日已經好夠啦。我自己覺得就唔需要有第二個。如果第二個都係咁就好重複啦，就唔係一個好故事。咁有啲意外啦，即係呢個大文豪寫嘢真係估你唔到啊！竟然係冇結果嘅，毫無結果可言。
因為之前 Wemmick 又成日叫佢去食飯，好似
係啦，即係煞有介事。而阿 Pip 都心裏面都隱然都知道其實係咩意義㗎啦。咁但係你真係食餐飯喎，而家係你真係食咗餐飯，我食咗啲魚，食咗啲 mutton。係咪？有啲 fruits 喺側邊，好好食。每一餐咧，啲碟咧，啲刀叉都換過晒嘅。但係呢個唔係重點啊嘛，個重點係你要個 conversation 啊嘛，係咪？好啦，咁期待佢下一節啦，會有啲交代啦，好嘛？下次再傾。OK。